This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be found acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Our text for today comes from this letter to the Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. We must always give thanks to God for you, brothers and sisters, as is right, because your faith is growing abundantly, and the love of every one of you for one another is increasing. Therefore, we ourselves boast of you among the churches of God for your steadfastness and faith during all your persecutions and the afflictions that you are enduring. Our theme, giving thanks for the faithful. The two New Testament letters to the Thessalonians were written to the church at Thessalonica. Wow, hard word to call. Thessalonica, which Paul founded on his second missionary journey. The apostle had received word that there were certain individuals who had sprung up in this congregation and who were misleading the Christians in this newly formed church of the Thessalonians. And they were teaching them something about the day of the Lord and was saying that that day had already come. The day of the Lord having to do with the second coming of Christ. So these letters were written to correct this false teaching and encourage the Christians in that place. In reading these letters, we sense the pride and the joy that St. Paul felt about this congregation, these Christians in that area. The apostle is thankful for the Christians, and in today's passage, Paul highlights three characteristics about these people, these Christians, that are worth highlighting today and which made him thankful to God for the Christians in that place. And not only that, the three characteristics that are highlighted by Paul, which he lifts up in thanksgiving to God, are characteristics that make a church strong. And the first that we can mention is the feature of the church being one where the Christians were growing in faith. Paul expresses thanks to God for the exceeding growth in faith of the Thessalonians. He writes, "We must always give thanks to God for you, my brothers and sisters, as it is right, because your faith is growing abundantly." Now, faith has to do with belief in God, confidence in God, trusting in God. And there is nothing that pleases pastors more than being able to observe their members' growth in faith. And I am sure that Paul was extremely delighted he was extremely proud of these Christians for the abundant growth in faith that he observed in them. Now, while this type of growth is not as easy to measure as, say, physical growth, Paul must have seen something about the Thessalonians that led him to comment on their growing faith. Not only was their faith growing, according to the text, it was doing so abundantly. In other words, these Christians were maturing rapidly in the faith. They were not stagnant. They were moving from one stage to another, as every Christian is expected to. They were growing in the faith, and their growth was rapid and abundant. So the question, my friends, that we might ask is this: what accounted for such growth among the Thessalonians? It was likely their discipline to the study of the Word, their attention to the Scriptures, their willingness to pay attention to what the apostle had taught them, that led to such abundant growth. The fellowship that they shared, their time in worship and receiving the sacraments, these are the factors that must have contributed to their rapid growth in the faith. Now, it is important to understand that faith requires nurture and exercise. Just as we care about our physical development and eat nutritional meals in order to nourish the cells in our bodies, since nutrient depletion is one of those factors that affect cell growth and the functioning of our bodies. So, faith needs to be fed in order for it to grow. If we neglect to feed our faith, if we neglect to feed on the Word of God and to do those things that help to build up our faith, then our faith will be stunted. Our faith will be malnourished. If the Thessalonians had ignored what they were required to do in order for their faith to grow, then Paul, who founded the church there, would not have been able to comment on their faith and how it was growing so abundantly. So through the study of the Scriptures, through prayer and worship, faith grows, faith matures. So what are the signs then, my friends? What are the indicators that Christians are growing in the faith? Maybe the next thing that Paul mentions, the next thing for which he gives thanks, is one of those indicators or one of those signs. And if you look at the text, you will see where Paul speaks about their increasing love for one another. Paul also expresses thanks for the love of the Thessalonians for one another, and how their love for one another was increasing. Hear what he writes: "And the love of every one of you for one another is increasing." What a lovely thing to say about people in a church. What a wonderful thing to say about members of a congregation, that the love of every one of you for one another is increasing. I would like to be able to say that of this congregation. And I find that this is a lovely thing to say. To see people increasing in their love for one another is a glorious thing to behold. To see Christians living in love is a wonderful sign. In fact, in the Acts of the Apostles, it is said of the Christians, see how they love one another. Love is always that hallmark of a Christian. Especially when it is, as the writer puts it here, every one of you for one another. Think about that for a while. Every one of you for one another. What he's saying, my friends, is that it wasn't just some of the Christians who were increasing in love for some of their fellow Christians. You know, it is possible in a congregation that some members might get along with some other members because they were always friends, or because they live in the same neighborhood, or they support the same political party, or share similar views on certain issues. So you know, there's some people who might get along with one another, who might love or like one another for those reasons. The difference that Paul points out in this passage, the difference that he sees among the Thessalonians, is that their concern was that everyone, they were concerned for everyone. Each was concerned for everyone else. Everyone had an increasing love for everyone else in the church. Now, that is not easy to achieve. And it is a reflection of their growing faith because it takes maturity. It takes a mature Christian to be able to love everyone in the same way, because we are all different. In some churches, you find some people who get along well, and then others who don't. This is what we call division. And you find it in some churches, that some people get along well with some people, but they don't get along well with other people in the same congregation. And what Paul is saying here is that among the Thessalonians, everyone was increasing in love for everyone else. It wasn't a case where I love you, but I don't love the brother or sister across the aisle from you. Paul was certainly impressed by the love the Thessalonians had for one another. My friends, love is the cement that holds the church together. And a church, a congregation, is strongest when the members are increasing in their love and each person is loving everyone else. I love you, you love me, and my love and your love being extended to every brother and sister. We'd be a strong force within our community if we can love like that. And finally, the other indicator of how strong this church was is their enduring faith. That's what I call it, the enduring faith. Paul gives thanks for the enduring patience, the steadfastness and faith of the Thessalonians in the face of trials. In fact, he boasted about it. He writes, therefore we ourselves boast of you among the churches of God, for your steadfastness and faith during all your persecutions and the afflictions that you are enduring. Paul boasted about these people. They didn't embarrass him because of their attitudes, because of their lack of faith or their lack of love. So he could boast about them, about their faith remaining steadfast in the face of all the trials that they face. I find that to be remarkable. For a pastor, the founder of a congregation, to be able to stick his neck out and boast about his congregation to other congregations, to other people, that takes some confidence and some knowing your people to be able to do that. You see, my friends, it is one thing to have a growing faith. It is another to have a faith that is enduring. Individuals may experience a growth spurt in their faith. You know, their faith may grow abundantly for a while, for a season. But how long will that continue is important. Will it stand the test of time and circumstances? Will that faith shrink in times of adversity and testing? And that is what Paul is dealing with here. It is important to remember that in order for faith to grow, it has to be exercised. Just as our bodies need exercise so that they can be fit, so too we need to exercise our faith so that it can grow and become stronger over time. You see people lifting weights. You see people jogging and walking and exercising in all kinds of ways. And so, my friends, we have to exercise our faith in order for that faith to be built up, for that faith to be strong and to be able to endure. And what impressed Paul about the Thessalonians, and something about which he boasted, is that even though they had their share of persecution and afflictions, they endured. They didn't give up when the going got rough. They didn't quit when they experienced frustration or failure, disappointment or disagreement. They remained steadfast, steady. Oh, for steady Christians. Oh, for members of the church who would be steady in their faith, committed, dedicated, not hot one time and cold the other. Not here one time because it's convenient and nice, and not another time because it is difficult and perhaps a little inconvenient. They remained steadfast, and Paul lifted them up as an example of what it means to have enduring faith. George Muller said, and I quote, "God delights to increase the faith of his children. We ought, instead of wanting no trials before victory, no exercise for patience, to be willing to take them from God's hand as a means. I say, and say it deliberately, trials, obstacles, difficulties, and sometimes defeats are the very food of faith. We should take them out of his hands as evidences of his love and care for us in developing more and more that faith which he is seeking to strengthen in us." End of quote. So my friends, rather than giving up their faith, the Thessalonians remained steadfast in faith when they were persecuted and afflicted. And this is the story of all the saints with whom we join today. Remaining steadfast, persevering in the midst of difficulties, continuing in the faith, not quitting, and in the end, coming out of the great tribulation, having kept the faith and receiving the never-fading crown of life. I pray that following the example of the Thessalonians, we may all grow in faith, we may all increase in our love for one another, and we'll have the faith that endures the test of time. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.